Right, good morning. How's everybody? That good? Everyone hanging in there? I was looking at it, I was telling my class before this, if you look at the calendar, we have today, and then we have Monday and Wednesday, and then it's spring break. So it's very soon, right? I feel like it's needed for all of us, right? Like we're all there. We're talking about burnout in my class before this. I feel like that's probably fairly applicable to where we all are at the moment. But we'll meet today, and then on Monday, and then on Wednesday, we have our second exam, so we actually won't be meeting, and then we will be on spring break. So I just want to take a minute to talk about that, and then also the paper, and I know I've mentioned it several times, but just to mention it one more time, the second part of the paper, right, it is due today before 11:59 p.m. tonight. So you're turning it in on Canvas. And I showed you this before, but just one more time, if you go to modules on our Canvas page and then scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's this whole category of participations, diagnosis paper, and exams. So it's right here where you click diagnosis paper part 2. And then you can upload it right here where it says start assignment. So make sure at some point today, before 11:59 p.m., you upload your paper onto there. Remember that it's only doc.x, PDF, and RTF. So if you have pages or something like that, you will need to convert it. But it's due by almost just before midnight tonight. If you don't get it in by that deadline, you can email it to me late. It's 10% off per day, which is what, 4 points. So that's better than not, right? I stopped counting at half off. So better late than never. So if you don't make that deadline for whatever reason, something happens, you can always email it to me tomorrow or the next day. Sooner would be better so you don't lose a bunch of points. But it is worth 40 points. We talked about it a few times. You want to make sure you have that source, which is worth 10 points, and then some progress towards your final paper. And several people have already turned it in. But if you haven't yet, you have all the way until this evening to work on that or get that in. You obviously can still change your character. If you decided this week that you want to do somebody else, that's totally fine. But are there any last questions about that before, while we're together, before you have to turn it in on your own later? Any other questions or anything about that part of the paper? We talked about it a bunch, but just to double check one more time. So again, that's right here. And then likely what'll happen is I'll be grading them like slowly over the weekend. So hopefully by the time I see you next, I'll have them all graded. And it's out of 40 points. So as long as you give me that source, which is worth 10 points, and then progress toward your final paper, you should be in good shape. So my goal with this again is to get you thinking about it and working on it now rather than waiting until the very end to do the whole paper. So the more work you put into it, the more feedback I can give you, but make sure it is at least, if you scroll down here, at least like 2 to 3 pages, and then has that source and the citation for it. And as a side note, you can always give me too much, right? Like I will never take off points for you giving me more than like the requirement, but you don't want to do less, right? So if you give me like barely 2 pages or like only a page, I'll tell you it was too short. If you turn in 5 pages, you won't lose points or anything for that. I had a teacher in graduate school who, like, if it was over, would take off points for every word that it was over, right? So that was harsh, right? I would never do that. That's a lot of work too, to count like the words and I don't know, whatever. It wasn't worth it. But if it's over, that's fine. Just make sure it's not on them. The other thing I want to point out, just while we're here on Canvas, is that next Wednesday, right? So we obviously meet today and then we'll meet on Monday. On Wednesday next week is exam number 2, right? And remember, we are doing the exams virtually, so the exams will be online. Yeah.
Sorry, I just thought of a question.
Yeah.
Can we only diagnose them with mental disorders or illnesses that we learned already?
No, it can be any recognized like mental illness or psychological disorder. So we've only gotten to like what, half of them maybe. So it could definitely be one we haven't covered yet, or maybe that we didn't even cover, period, that you know of. That's totally fine. And they might have more than one disorder. I would say if you were thinking of diagnosing your character with more than one disorder, limit yourself to like 2. If you do much more than that, it's just going to be too much for you to have to cover. Or you can always take a paragraph and be like, I think they have some other things going on, and talk about like all the other stuff. But yeah, 1 to 2 disorders at the most, and just one character. A couple of you were like, there's several characters I want to diagnose, but just pick one, and that way you can really focus on that one person. Unless they have multiple personalities, in which case you could talk about all the personalities, right? That would work too. So when we get to Wednesday next week, we won't meet in person. I'll remind you on Monday, I'll send out an announcement, but on the day of the exam, we won't have class in person. Now, my goal is that you could take that time. So you could take from 10 to 11:15 to take the exam, but you could take it at home. You could take it in the library. You could come here and take it in here if you wanted to, though I can't guarantee it'll be quiet for you. But you can take it at any point on that Wednesday. It'll open up at 12:01 a.m. and close at 11:59 p.m. So if you need different time to take it or want to take it later in the day, that's totally possible for you. But we won't meet in person on that day. You'll be taking it on here on Canvas, just like you did the first exam. So it's right here. And again, it'll open up that morning and then close that evening. So I'll remind you again on Monday, but I just wanted to put that on your mind. I wanted everything turned in and done before spring break so that you could actually enjoy your break. At least for this class, I can't speak to other ones, but I didn't want you having to study for a test or working on a paper on your vacation time. So, any other questions about the test, the paper, any of that kind of stuff? Just looking at our schedule coming up here. Okay. So what we will do today is we're going to start chapter 10, and then we will definitely finish that up on Monday. I have to end early today, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sure you're really mad at me for that, but I have to end early. I have a meeting with, we have a new dean, and we're having a meeting, which sounds bad, but it's not, right? Hopefully it's not. I don't know. She seems nice. But I have a meeting with her, so I do have to end a little bit early for that. So we won't get too far into this, but I do want to kind of set the stage, talk about the first few bullets here. And then when I see you on Monday, we'll talk about the main disorders and the causes and treatments. And then we'll do a little case study, kind of like we did with eating disorders, to pull it all together. So our goal for today will just be to get through the first few slides. And then again, I'm sorry, I have to end early, but hopefully that's nice. Hopefully it gives you a little extra time instead of being like upset with me. So with this whole chapter, we're looking at the effects of psychoactive drugs. And I want to point something out. Do you remember when we, in the very beginning, we talked about with every single disorder, you have to have two criteria, right? That one of them is that it causes significant distress or impairment in your life. The second one comes into play here. It cannot be due to the use of a substance or a general medical condition. So it gets really tricky when we start looking at substance-related disorders. With things like anxiety, for example, you can't have anxiety due to the use of a drug, or we'd actually consider it a substance-related disorder. If somebody has depression because they're using a drug, we don't define it as depression, we define it as a substance-induced depression. So this is where we can bring in this piece of if somebody is using a substance that's causing them problems in their life or creating other issues, it would fall into this group that we're going to cover. Or if somebody's having issues related to the substance in general, like they're craving it, they're wanting it, they're spending a lot of time using it and all that kind of stuff, that's where this would fall as well. So kind of a chance, several of your characters, if I remember correctly, there was some of this that might be there. This is where we're bringing those disorders in.
Does this include like drug-induced psychosis?
Yes, right. So if you've ever heard anyone say drug-induced schizophrenia or psychosis or whatever, that's where we're saying that the drug use has caused someone to develop psychosis or schizophrenia or whatnot. Drug-induced anxiety. So oftentimes when people take stimulants, they might have, cocaine-induced anxiety. So their anxiety is the result of using cocaine. Now, the tricky thing is maybe they were using cocaine because they had another issue already going on. So you often have to figure out which came first, but that's exactly where this comes in. There's a substance use disorder, and then there's a substance-induced disorder. There's really only two big disorders in this chapter. So when we're talking about psychoactive drugs, a psychoactive drug is any chemical substance that's going to change your mood or your perception. Now, this is an absolutely massive group of substances. This is everything that is legal and illegal, prescribed or purchased. This is ranging from like Advil or Tylenol or like even like cough medicine to heroin, LSD, marijuana. Antidepressants would fall into this. Any drug that you take would qualify as a psychoactive drug. Just looking around, like there's a couple of people with coffee, right? Caffeine, right, as mild as it is a psychoactive drug. You can become addicted to it or dependent on it, right? You could become addicted and dependent on painkillers, right? On any of the drugs that are up here and so on. So this is just an absolute ton of substances. And sometimes people struggle with one, sometimes it's multiple, and sometimes people take a drug and they don't struggle at all. The average person can take a drug every now and then, obviously depending on the drug, and not develop addiction or tolerance or issues. But then there are some people who take a drug once and they have problems with it right away, right? So there's an incredible range of how this can present. And sometimes the scary part is you don't know how you're going to react to a drug. But I can't remember if it was in this class or my other one, but like, I can't even take NyQuil. Was it this class that I told you about that? Yeah, right? Like little things like that. Like for me, it's just devastating. Like my oldest daughter is very much the same way. If we give her a nighttime medicine, she kicks the wall all night, like all night long, just thrashing, kicking the wall and like crying. And so we know not to give her nighttime medication. Everybody reacts in a very different way to each different substance. But what we do know is that the idea of using substances has been around for a very long time. For as long as we have recorded history of people trying to alter their consciousness through the use of substances, whether that was like mead or alcohol or different like plants and different like kind of naturally occurring substances. We see it throughout written and like documented history. So it's not anything new, but the way that drugs are used now is a little bit different than they used to be used in the past. In the past, drugs were used more for like spiritual and medicinal purposes. And now what we see is they're used more for recreational purposes, like to relieve boredom or to do something fun or to feel differently, versus they were more like traditions and honoring the gods or, you know, part of a spiritual journey in the past. And drugs have also become more unpredictable and less natural, right? We have a lot more synthetically created like substances than we did in the past. But again, this isn't something new, right? For as long as we've had substances, people have been using them to alter their consciousness. And when you use a drug, it can cause a temporary change in your behavior, emotions, or thoughts, or it can be something that can cause long-term changes and long-term patterns of like maladaptive behavior. And that's where, again, everybody's so different. Some people can take a drug and be just fine, and other people take it once and they become addicted to it or they crave it, and it's something that is more difficult for them to break. Now, there are an incredible number of substances, and I'm not going to really spend much time talking about the substances. That's kind of outside the scope of our class. But if you wanted to learn more about them, we have a great like neuropsych class that we teach here. Really a hard class, but a great class. It's one of my least favorite and most favorite at the same time, like, because it's challenging, but it's so interesting. You'll learn a little bit more about how substances affect the body. People can become addictions counselors and really specialize in all this. I will just kind of introduce the different categories and the drugs that tend to fall in them. And our focus will be more on the disorders, which we'll get to more on Monday. But I found this little video, and this is something that oftentimes people ask, like not really understanding how drugs affect our body and how they work. And there are different categories, which we'll talk about, but I think this video is kind of helpful. It's about 5 minutes, so I'm going to share it with you. I'll just back up. A nice job of kind of introducing like how drugs affect our body, right? And we've talked about neurotransmitters several different times at this point, right? They all play a role in a lot of different disorders. But what happens is drugs, when we take them, right, they're affecting us drastically, right? And some of them, like they said in here, can cause long-term changes, right? We talked about with antidepressants that sometimes people can take them for a short period of time, and it's almost like their body balances out and they can go back off of them. Other people have to take them for longer periods of time or maybe indefinitely. So when you take a substance, it can literally cause changes that are permanent in your brain and in your body, which is why some of them are so dangerous and controlled. Right, so it's an incredible range, of course, But there are lots of different substances. And again, I'll just kind of introduce them, but we won't spend much time there. Yeah. Sure. I didn't hear that. You know, I'm not sure that that's true, right? So DMT, right, it's a hallucinogenic drug. It's very similar to like LSD. Or the name itself, it's often referred to as, but that it's released in your brain. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But it is a drug that like a hallucinogenic drug. So I read something about that too. Like I kind of know what you're talking about, but not enough that I'm not sure. Honestly.
About one of these drugs. I mean, not hallucinogenic, but they're not alternates neurotransmitters.
Yeah, so nicotine is a stimulant, and it's on the list that we'll talk about briefly. But yeah, nicotine is actually a very fast working drug, and it's incredibly addictive. Right, it's the most addictive substance of almost all of the drugs that are out there. And if any of you have ever tried to quit smoking and listening to your eyes, you can see why. But it takes effect so quickly that it tends to have a very rewarding kind of effect. It's difficult to stop taking. But yeah, it's a stimulant. So that one's a little bit different. Any other thoughts or questions or comments or anything for the moment? All right. So in general, we tend to divide drugs up into 3 different groups. Now, sometimes you'll hear about a 4th group, but for the most part, 3. And again, I'm not going to talk about the drugs necessarily. I just kind of share which ones tend to fall in each group. But depressants are the first group. And depressants, as it says up here, are chemicals that slow down your thinking, your behavior, your mental processes. They depress or slow you down. They make it difficult to think clearly or to have a lot of energy. They oftentimes make you sleepy or very sedated, sometimes calm. And some of the very common depressants, alcohol. Alcohol is probably the most commonly used depressant of them all. And you might have the thought of like, oh, when I drink, like I feel like stimulated and have more energy. Like sometimes alcohol can kind of start out feeling stimulating, but its ultimate effect is that it's a depressant. It does tend to make you sleepy and tired, and it impairs your cognitive ability, which is why people make bad choices or like have less strong decision making and like impulse control when they drink. Sedative hypnotic drugs or anxiolytic drugs, as they're sometimes called. These are the things like the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines, Xanax, Valium, drugs that people take to sometimes calm down or help with anxiety. Are very common, often very commonly abused as well. And we'll talk about this next week. Sometimes people combine substances, which can make them even more powerful and often much more dangerous as well. Very common that people combine things like Valium and Xanax with alcohol, which is incredibly dangerous to do. But sometimes combining drugs can make them even more powerful and more dangerous. The opioids also fall into here, morphine, heroin. And then the body has natural opioids like the endorphins, which are kind of natural painkillers that are in our system. But a lot of different substances. These are some of the bigger ones. Again, alcohol probably being the most common. And then when it comes to like prescribed medications, like Valium and Xanax would also kind of fall into here as well. The second group are the stimulants. And just like it says, with stimulants, they stimulate you, right? Like you tend to feel very up, have a lot of energy. They produce feelings of like optimism and energy, sleeplessness. Oftentimes when people use stimulants heavily, they don't sleep as much. It can also curb appetite, which can make them even more addictive. Lots and lots of substances here, cocaine, amphetamines, which are traditionally more like pill-based. Ecstasy or MDMA, nicotine, which you asked about, falls into this group. And as I said, probably one of the more addictive substances. And then caffeine, energy drinks, you could also add that to it. I drink a cup of coffee like every morning, right? I wouldn't say that I'm like addicted to coffee, but if I don't drink it, I sometimes get a headache or I feel tired, right? Some of you nodding, right? Like I'm sure I'm not alone on like that, whether it's coffee or like some kind of energy drink or whatever. Caffeine is a very, very commonly used drug. And it's a milder drug, but it can definitely become problematic, right? Even the milder drugs can become problematic for people when they become abused. Right? And I worked at Starbucks for a long time when I was in graduate school. And it was such a great job, like because I like stayed caffeinated for free during college, right? It was amazing. But I often felt like a drug pusher at Starbucks. Like people would come through like cranky and mad, like I need my coffee, right? And then they would have their coffee and I'd see them like take a sip and like calm down. Like, oh man, I feel like I just gave you your fix, right? And I'd watch people develop tolerance, you know, where they'd start with like a tall, and then it was a grande, and then it was a venti, and then a triple venti and a quad venti, like, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and more and more. That can happen with people when they take drugs, right? They can develop a tolerance, and you need more and more of it, or you feel lousy when you don't have it. And we'll talk about those symptoms when we get to the criteria for substance use disorder. The last group, hallucinogen. Hallucinogens are any drugs that are going to kind of alter or distort your visual and auditory perception. So we sometimes call these psychedelic or mind manifesting drugs, because oftentimes what happens when people use these is they experience things in the absence of sensory input. So seeing things that aren't there, or hearing things that aren't there, feeling things that aren't present, maybe having distorted thoughts about what you can or can't do. And when we talk about things like drug-induced psychosis or schizophrenia, it's typically as a result of using hallucinogens. They tend to be a more like difficult or more impacting category of drugs because they affect so many different regions of the brain and so many different neurotransmitters. Now, traditionally, we could talk about things like LSD, like there are quite a few drugs that would fall into this category. Interestingly, we tend to categorize marijuana as a hallucinogen. Now, it's often sometimes put in depressants as well, but this is where it tends to be housed, just because it does have a mild hallucinogenic property to it, right? It can distort people's perception of like time and like movement. And so because it distorts that, we tend to put it here. Now, nicotine is the most addictive of all drugs. Marijuana is the most frequently used illegal drug of all drugs. And it's only illegal in some places. It's the most complicated legality-wise as well, right? Depending on where you live, there's all sorts of different rules about how much of it you can have or not have and the uses for it, where you can use it. It's a very like politically involved drug, right? That there's been a lot of legislation on over the years. But marijuana does definitely have, you know, positive and negative attributes to it. It's used for some things that are more like medicinal and positive, but it can also affect your memory and your motivation and other things as well. People tend to think it's less dangerous because it's legalized, but interestingly, nicotine is actually way more dangerous than marijuana. And there's a lot of like rhetoric about if they were discovered at the same time, that marijuana would have been the one that was legalized, and nicotine would be the one that was illegal, right? Because it has so many negative effects on like addiction and on other people as well. Yeah. Yeah, so if you go way back, right, there was a lot of like economic stuff related to nicotine and tobacco. You go back hundreds of years. Tobacco was such a huge like money-making industry that it became legalized. And we knew more about it, and it was regulated differently. It was discovered first, and so it became one that became like economically driven and very money-oriented. Versus marijuana that was discovered later and popularized later, and had a lot of stigma attached to it. So there's a lot of talk that if you read articles on it, that if they were discovered in a flip order, it would be reversed. Because marijuana at least does have some positive attributes to it, and medicinal uses. So I mean, it can be abused and become addicted like any other drug, but it does have some positive attributes versus nicotine. I went to Humboldt State, so, right? I mean, I didn't know. Believe me or not, that's up to you. I'll leave it up to you to decide if you believe me or not. But I grew up in a very sheltered family, and so like I went to Humboldt because of different greenery. I went because of the trees. I was like, it's beautiful. There are trees, it rains all the time, it's cold. And then when I got up there, I learned that it had an incredible reputation. Every time I tell someone I went to Humboldt State, I get that like, Humboldt State. I'm like, no, I didn't know, I swear. I mean, I know now, but I didn't. You can take that for whatever you want. But marijuana up there was such a culture up there, and I was really unprepared for how like entrenched in the culture it was in that area. And then again, there's a lot of really interesting like policies around this drug as we learn more and more about it. But like any other drug, it can definitely be abused and have negative side effects. Sometimes we talk about a fourth group that we would call inhalants. Whenever somebody is taking something that they're inhaling to get high from. But for our purposes, we're really focusing on these three as the three main groups of substances. And a lot of examples in each, and that's as far as we'll get into them, but definitely many, many different substances that can be used. So what we'll do next time, I have like 4 more minutes before I have to stop. So just a couple of other thoughts here. And again, I'm sorry to stop early, don't be mad at me. Be happy. You don't have to sit in a meeting. You get to go enjoy something for me instead. But what we'll talk about next time, there's intoxication, which is like a temporary state. And then there's a couple of disorders. Like I said, there's really 2 of them. So we'll talk about the criteria for substance use disorder, the timing, the criteria, and what you have to meet that. And then we'll look at substance-induced disorder, which is the other big one in this group. And then we'll go into causes and treatments. We'll look at a case study, as I said, and so on. Yeah.
What exactly is psychosis?
So psychosis, I'm glad you asked, right? So psychosis, if somebody's psychotic, what that means is they have lost contact with reality. So that's what psychosis means. It's kind of like an umbrella term. It's not a disorder in itself. So when somebody is psychotic, they are no longer in touch with reality. Typically, that means they're hearing or seeing things that aren't there. Or having like false beliefs about the world. Schizophrenia is an example of a psychosis. And when someone's psychotic, they might have something like schizophrenia, which is our next chapter that we'll talk about right after spring break. So I'm glad you asked, because it's an umbrella term for people who have lost contact with it. Most other disorders are neurosis or neurotic, where people have emotions that are out of control, versus psychosis is much more severe. Yeah, of course. Any other questions or thoughts or comments or anything? Please don't forget that the paper is due by the end of the day today. And again, if you don't make the deadline for whatever reason, you can email it to me late. And there'll be a little bit of a penalty, but that's way better than not turning it in. And then don't forget that next week, our second exam is coming up. If you wanted to start preparing a little bit, the study guide is on Canvas, so you could start looking at that and start thinking about it in advance if you want to. I'm now up here for a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, you can come check in with me. Otherwise, have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the little bit of extra time, and I'll see you on a Monday.
I won't be here on Monday.
Okay.
You know,
Okay. And
from out of town.
all right. So what we'll be doing on Monday is we'll be